Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you may be joining us from. As mentioned, my name is Ty Henson, and I'm a Senior Solution Architect with Worksoft for roughly the past 10 years. Some of you may know me. You may know that prior to this life, I was a customer of Worksoft, and I was using Worksoft for web testing, so that was over 10 years ago. And my experience with this runs pretty deep, and I've been talking about it ever since. So I look forward to the conversation today, and let's get started. So today we're going to talk about what modern web actually means and the challenges that it can bring at times to your automation initiatives. So I've talked about this with many customers along the way as well, as mentioned, for the past 10 years plus. But today I've added a little bit of verbiage here for anybody that might not be familiar with Worksoft as a company and what we do. Really, the key is that Worksoft is providing the ability to automate without the need for programming. And yet the automation that we build very conveniently, very easily is sustainable, which is important because we don't want to be spending time maintaining our automation or we'll never achieve the high levels of coverage that we need to with all of our testing. And it's easy to scale for that purpose, though we're not going to focus specifically on scalability today. The other seed that I want to plant is that we're interoperable with your DevOps tools and all development methodologies that you might be using. So we've covered this in prior webinars. We will absolutely be covering this in future webinars, but for today's session, we're going to focus primarily on the automation itself around modern web and the challenges that we can encounter with doing that. All right, so there's no doubt that it is a web-filled world, and we knew that web itself was going to be life-changing, and it absolutely has been. I credit the banks and the phones primarily for the proliferation of this technology, and it's basically because once the banks were able to prove that our money was safe and yet still conveniently available in the mobile devices that we hold in our hands, then companies began to really listen, and vendors began to produce applications for companies that were much more progressive and responsive, just like the applications that we were used to as users of our mobile phones, for example. So there's actually varying definitions of what progressive is and what responsive is, and I'm not going to focus in on any one of them other than the fact that they all refer to the ability for us to be able to use our applications with very little, if any, training. Make things intuitive so that every user can participate and understand. And responsive is typically about the ability for the application to manipulate itself and fit into whatever container we happen to be using that application in. So a responsive application that I use on my desktop might actually render slightly differently when I bring it up on the mobile device, yet in the background, it is the exact same application delivering the content. So why do we care about this? Well, the fact is that we need to be able to test and make sure at all times that our business is running, that our applications are working, and that our users are productive and not being held up by those types of problems. So the modern, progressive, and responsive applications, though bringing much more productivity to the front end and to the users, has made that automation ability a little bit more challenging and more complex in the background. So I'm going to pick on Salesforce. On about page 417 of the Salesforce Spring 19 release notes, Salesforce reinforces exactly what we're talking about in the previous slide. They're talking about their own CRM-based SaaS application. And in the notes, there are these types of comments that we pulled out for this particular slide. First and foremost, DOM inspection tests are subject to change. The content and structure of HTML, CSS, and DOM in the Lightning experience can change at any time and can't be considered a stable application programming interface. This is not a change in the Spring 19, as we've never guaranteed backward compatibility. And then skipping forward, we're calling out the fragility, and that's a word that we highlighted, of these tests, again, due to changes in this release as Lightning experience continues to evolve with modern web standards. And that's really the key. So they understand in the last statement here that automation is necessary. We understand the value that our customers gain from automated UI testing and the maintenance burden that the previous statement puts on them, the fact that things can change and things are not stable. So at the same time that we're needing to keep up with more testing than we've ever needed to, we can no longer rely on manual testing for that purpose because it only scales linearly. We need to be able to use automation, yet the application vendors are well aware that the things that they're providing can be challenging from an automation perspective. So the end result for the user is fantastic. Here's, a quick example of a next generation field service application. I can bring up and with a few simple clicks know exactly where my clients are at and even apply traffic to know how close I am to them with respect to that. So it's easy to see that this complexity is bringing high value to the user, yet making it more difficult for us to keep up with the testing that's needed to make sure that our business is constantly running. In this case, we're looking at the Fiori design guidelines, and Fiori comes to us from SAP for anybody that's not familiar. And we love what they're doing here. Look at all of these widgets. I'm just going to click and allow this to scroll through. These are now web-based widgets that are coming into the Fiori UI5 initiative, and they're doing this to provide high value to their users, bringing information very readily available to the user interface for the users to be as productive as possible. Yet some of this complexity, again, can make it more difficult to do the automated testing. In fact, I'm going to take a sideline here to mention as well. Some of you may have heard, I get this quite a bit from people that I speak with in the field, that they've heard of Worksoft and they recognize that Worksoft is good at SAP testing. And not only do I agree with that, but what is not as obvious to everyone at this point is that SAP really now is web. The entire UI5 initiative is all about bringing productivity and modern and progressive and responsive web applications to the users for that purpose. And not only the Fiori initiative, but all of the acquisitions, things like SuccessFactors, Ariba, and Concur, and more, are also SaaS-based applications, web-based applications that are progressive and responsive in those ways. So all of this ends up being complexity that we need to deal with and that can render web challenges from an automation perspective. It's not a guarantee, but it's things that we have to be well aware of from an automation perspective and make sure that the solution that we're using can provide for the needs. So I've referred to this complexity behind the scenes a couple of times now, so let's break this down a little bit. The fact is that you simply cannot look at a website on the surface and know if it's going to be an automation challenge or not. But with a couple of visits and some simple analysis, you can begin to determine things like the following. Web is constantly changing. Ironically or not, the ability to quickly deliver convenient applications and frequent change is what's bringing this high value, yet making our testing burden much more of a problem. So vendors are using the web because it's so easy to deliver, but yet they're taking advantage of the ability to change web on a regular basis. In fact, I inserted a snapshot here of some of those SaaS applications, some of which have already been mentioned, and just showing a little bit about the frequency of which these things are changing. Now, of course, the application vendors are testing their own product, but are they testing your specific configuration? We hear time and time again about how a monthly change, for example, has come out and broken a part of the business. And the other thing that's not being stated here is the fact that these applications are used as best of breed to provide an overall business process experience for our users. So when something is broken in the middle, the entire business process shuts down, and we cannot afford to let those types of adverse conditions stop our business from doing what it's doing, which is making money. So we call them unintended consequences. We want to change and improve, but when we encounter those times, what we might introduce are problems in other areas, which really drives the need for being able to test And the only way to keep up with that at this point is with automated testing. It's also a little bit of the wild, wild west from an HTML perspective. I don't know if any of you have dabbled with web development, but basically the W3C standards provide a framework for web structure, but there really are various ways to provide the end result to the users, and developers take advantage. Some developers may not follow the standards, and even those that do may actually push the boundaries and make the back-end content more complex for the automation to understand. The question is, does your automation solution accommodate for that and still allow you to be the master of web testing? So for even those that are following the standards, they can get fairly complex structurally. One legitimate example, and this may sound a little confusing, so I'm going to say this nice and slow, but one legitimate example is what I refer to as a multi-table table. And I realize that sounds strange, but often what looks like a single table to the user might actually consist of several tables behind the scenes to accomplish the task, which is, let's hold the headers in place while the end user has the ability to scroll the data. So the headers themselves might be a single table in the background where the data is then a separate table. And in that two-table combination, the end result looks to the end user like a natural table. So the question is, will your automation solution be able to recognize and deal with those situations? In fact, there are times when things that look like tables in the UI are not tables at all in the back end, yet are constructed to, again, look to the user like a table, yet we still may want to perform table-like actions like find row or input into cell, even though the structure itself in play is not a table. And once again, it's important to know that your automation solution can handle those conditions, and Worksoft certainly can. Some development frameworks auto-generate dynamic IDs for web content. And I'm getting a little bit into the weeds here. So if you're not familiar with what I'm saying, I wouldn't pay too much attention to it as long as the automation solution that you're using can accommodate. The relevance of this is that an ID of an object on a web page by W3C standards is the perfect identifier for objects because it's supposed to be unique. But if that changes with each subsequent visit to the page, then automation cannot rely on that alone to identify that object and reperform those actions. The AI in your automation engine must determine the best combination of full and/or fractional property values to use to identify each of those objects so that with each subsequent visit to the page, it still identifies the proper object and still takes the proper action. And we've done a lot within our AI engine within Worksoft to accommodate for that. So I had broken down a few of those web challenges, but I'll throw just a few more in the list. And this isn't exhaustive. These are things that are natural parts of modern web technology. Asynchronous round trips consist of the ability for a web page to go get a map, like we saw earlier in the quick version of the Salesforce page, basically. They don't necessarily have to navigate to a new page for that purpose, but the click of a button could easily make a round trip back to the web server and bring back and display content to the user. The question is, does your automation accommodate for that type of thing? And the keywords involved there are things like Ajax and jQuery, and we've made it a point within the Worksoft solution to absolutely accommodate. We talked about the structural complexity. Nested structures are very common, and even more and more as we begin to put more on the screen and provide for more productivity to the user, things become a little bit more complex. And so a quick example of that might be a combo or drop-down box sitting in the cell of a table on the screen. And can your automation distinguish the fact that those structures are nested and still find rows, yet make selections appropriately in those drop-down boxes? Lazy loading, again, probably a little bit more for web developers or those that have spoken with web developers, but I think with a brief explanation, everyone will understand what we're talking about here. If you could imagine a web page that contains 100 drop-downs and each of them contains 100 entries, Well, you might imagine that delivering that content to the web browser might be a little bit latent because it's sending so much information. And the fact is that historically, we would send all of that information up front, regardless of whether the users actually use those drop-down controls or not. So lazy loading is actually a fantastic idea that came about years ago, for which we now deliver just a framework of the front-end UI to the user. And as they begin to work with each dropdown, then we make a round trip back to the server to grab the contents of that combo box and populate it immediately to display that to the user and allow them to make their selection. The reason for that is that that framework, that very light framework that is delivered up front, is very performant. And we're only going to take the hit for transferring data between the server and the client for the objects that the user actually chooses to use. So it's much more performant overall. The challenge is, can your automation recognize that? And can the automation make sure to act just like an end user for the purpose of accommodating for the necessary events and actions for those lazy loaded objects? And last but not least, again, not an exhaustive list, but many of the web pages nowadays can house thousands of objects, even though not all of them are visible. There's a concept of a one-page website that becomes a very heavy web page to be delivered to a user, but as you interact with the objects, simply things become visible and non-visible throughout to provide the overall UI experience. When you're dealing with something like that, it's extremely important that your solution be extremely performant, because it has to traverse through all of those objects, whether they're visible or not, and determine what it needs to talk to at any given moment. So it becomes not necessarily a challenge, but a possible challenge for automation. And I just wanted to break down what some of those things were. I think the summary statement here is that automation really has to learn and act like an end user. So the result of modern web is that an automation expert has to do more to accommodate for these challenges, or the automation solution has to do much more to simplify the complexity and provide resilience. And that's what the Worksoft solution is attempting to do. It's attempting to help you be a master at web testing without the time and effort involved typically in mastering an objective. All right, so what I'd like to do is a little bit of a demo to get some visuals across the table, especially for those that may not be familiar with our solution. And even for those that are familiar with our solution, it's always important that we reinforce the concept of what the expectation of testing modern web should be in working with the Worksoft solution. So I'll describe as we go a little bit, but what I want to do is basically turn on capture, which is very much like a recording mechanism, but we call it capture intentionally because it's much more than just record. We will capture the activity of the user. We will show that to them line by line visually as they use the application. They'll be well aware of what's being captured on their behalf. And then I'm going to save that capture. I'll basically place a Fiori order using a modern web application. A Fiori order will save the automation. We'll take a quick look at the steps, and then we'll replay them. And so that is the expectation that I want to set, is that with very minimal effort, we should be able to capture our web activity, have very readable steps for any necessary maintenance in the future, and those steps should be great quality automation steps for replaying those actions on behalf of what was the manual user. So let's get this guy started. So for anybody that's not familiar, what I'm doing here is bringing up our editor and using a right-click operation to launch the capture window, which is now sitting on the right. For anybody that's familiar with SAP and Fiori, you might recognize the Fiori tiles on the left for which we can enter creating the sales order. So by clicking on the red button on capture, that turned capture on. And as I now proceed to place my Fiori order, I am simply acting like a normal user, entering values into fields, clicking buttons, clicking tabs, using the tab key as needed. In fact, the automation should never mandate how the user uses the application, yet should collect the activity of that user to be represented as automation for replay purposes. So in this particular case, I've satisfied the needs of my order. I've added some bike mirrors as my material, and I'm saving and turning off capture. Now we're keeping this simple, but you can imagine that a true business process might contain 30 of those, not only placing the order, but doing the delivery, doing the invoicing, going to another application, doing the fulfillment of the order. And Worksoft is all about end-to-end, though what we're displaying here is fairly tactical. One of those steps might consist of this, which is the steps that we performed to create that order. And you can see the narrative column in the center is explaining, using English, exactly what is happening with each step. All it required for us to build that was have the Worksoft solution set up and configured accordingly, and then we can capture and have readable automation as a result. Now, in this particular demonstration, I'm showing a right-click operation to insert a couple of steps, just to demonstrate that if, in fact, I did need to add things along the way, it's extremely simple to do. But then basically what we're going to do here now is click the Run button and have the same automation that we captured kick off and reperform a new order using those same actions. So when we click on Run, we're now progressing, and it's not as obvious since we're all remote from each other, but the first time was a manual user placing the order. This time is now the automation driving the front-end UI the exact same way that that manual user did it initially. Those steps were captured and now being replayed to accommodate for that testing. Everything is passed. For anybody that's not familiar, because I ran this interactively, it brought the granular set of result steps right back to the screen. But in that particular test, everything passed not only at the step level, but then when all steps have passed, then the overall process is reflected as a pass. So I wanted to give you that visual of how Worksoft, what Worksoft looks like in terms of testing modern web. And so we use the Fiori application for that purpose. Now, under the sheets, this is where it gets a little more granular, but I'll briefly just describe some of the foundational parts that we've been pioneers in creating, because it's extremely relevant. It's our ability to be performant and do what we do so strongly against even modern web and other technologies is based on the way that we've built our solution. And so we have a patented object action framework that is our ability to keep things readable, learn objects and store them in a central repository is the second bullet. Everything that we do within our solution goes into a central database, which means that that content is readily available to any other user. We are all about modularity. We are all about sharing. And in fact, things like objects that we learn from your application, that's all done automatically. We learn those objects, we store that, we create a definition in the proper way, and we store them in that central repository. And what's not known, or may be known, but what's not obvious on the front end of our application is that we try to learn any given object only once. So if two different users go through two different captures but come through the same screen, the objects that overlap will not be duplicated. We will in fact determine that these two different users have used the same object and store those objects just once, linking them into the steps that they're being used from. And the reason that's relevant is because that then reduces maintenance for times when those objects may in fact change and need to be touched. We do have modifiable configuration rules. The AI engine that I referred to continues to grow, but we have the ability to work with the content and the decisions and the rules involved. Dynamic operations are very simple to provide in those times of need. And we have seamless support for cross and interlaced technology. So what I mean by that specifically is you might have, well, let's use an example to get the point across. You may have an executable, a fat client application, but a particular frame of that is bringing up some web content. And the beauty of the Worksoft automation is that it doesn't care where those technologies are coming from or that they are interlaced with each other. If you perform steps in the executable portion, those steps will be built accordingly. And if you perform steps in the frame or the web portion of that example, those steps will be built accordingly and seamlessly. So I could have one step acting against the executable, the next step acting against web, which provides our ability to be cross-platform, yet keeping things readable and easy to maintain. We clearly learn the content that the user is capturing, and that is available in various forms, but throughout the use of our solution, we will automatically learn those things. We've talked about storing them centrally. And so overall, there's actually several features that create the ability for us to create tests in a very facilitated fashion. So we're trying to meet that expectation of being able to rapidly capture and then be able to understand and read the automation and then take that to scale. So beyond that foundation, which is extremely important, we continue to innovate. This is all that we do, and on a regular basis, we're constantly adding value. We're listening to our customers, and we're innovating with thoughts of our own. In the recent past, we've extended to a modern cross-browser engine that contains more AI capabilities and is not limited to any one browser. So it is a realistic expectation that you can capture content from one browser and replay it in another as is. Now, the only disclaimer there is that some of you may be aware that the web developer is well aware of the user agent or the browser that it's delivering content to real time. And some web developers will choose to deliver slightly different content based on the browser that they're delivering to. One quick example of that would be Google, who is actually a client of ours, but Google will deliver slightly different web content in the form of Gmail to the Chrome browser than they will to IE or Firefox. And that's because they're taking advantage of their own web browser for performance purposes and being the most performant by taking advantage of their own features. But that would be one example. But generally speaking, I do a lot of web captures where I'm able to collect that content and then replay it using other browsers. We have a patented extensibility framework, and we refer to that, or the acronym really is XF for extensibility framework. This really serves as part of our ability to optimize for modern web. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a few moments. So I'll come back to those optimizations, but I wanted to point that out because it's a relevant part of the innovations that we've been working on within our solution. Web engine injection. We talked about massive pages, even when it's not visually obvious, and the fact that your automation must be very performant. We have taken everything that we can, and instead of communicating with the browsers and to access the web content, we've injected ourselves into the browsers for the ability to perform within them. That's providing the ability for us to find and work with objects as quickly as possible, and in fact, learn more about the objects than we historically used to, which makes it one of our innovations. Visual capture experience, we saw briefly, the ability for the user to understand exactly what we're capturing on their behalf. And what we didn't get into in this particular demonstration is the fact that those users actually have some abilities. A capture user can drag and drop and reorder steps or delete steps if in fact they feel like they've made a mistake, basically. So there are powerful capabilities that come with capture that we didn't even get into, but it all starts with the ability to visualize and understand exactly what's being captured based on their own activity. And then advanced object attributes, also very foundational, but provides our ability really to see anything within the web page. I've had this question many times, but as a web tester for many years, I've dealt with many clients who wanted to validate the JavaScripts that are being injected within their e-commerce sites for adware, for example. And we can absolutely see and help you validate those things from an automation perspective. So just a quick inject that even from a more advanced and very granular perspective, we can do anything that we need to without the need for programming against these modern web applications. In this series of slides originally kind of shook out as past, present, and future, but in lieu of future, what I'm going to choose to do for today's meeting is talk a little bit more about the requirements that are driving our visions for the future and continuing to meet the expectation that we talked about, even in the face of continuous modernization of the web content that we're dealing with. So we are continuing to strive to add innovation, to listen to client needs around ease of use and keeping things programming free. We are continuing to strengthen our AI engine in terms of how we learn objects and how we detect what the user is doing to make that the most sustainable over time. And even working on initiatives around the fact that each execution represents another visit to that object that gives us an opportunity to re-inspect it. So we're learning more about the objects and the environments that they reside within, and we're monitoring more about how those objects are changing over time to allow us to make the right decisions in terms of getting back to them from an automation perspective. And the bottom line is that the expectation that we've mentioned or that we've talked about several times is all based on the ability to capture and then have reusable automation with minimal edits. So a lot of our future innovations are going to be about minimizing the touch points that are needed for taking a capture from a user and making that more reusable. And that gets it into the data realm and various other things. And so we've got many other innovations in the very near future that we'll be talking about from that perspective. So XF definitions. I was goofing with an associate recently, and we decided that they stand for extra fun. They really serve as a foundational part of our web optimization capability and the ability for our web engine to interpret content and use it appropriately. So I'd like to demonstrate basically the result of an optimization. We don't have time in this meeting today to drill into what an optimization is or how to build that in the Worksoft solution. But I'd like to show you that the results of these optimizations is extremely powerful and helping us to keep up with the modernization of the web content that we're needing to automate. So does anyone recognize this photograph? Raise your hand if you do. No, I'm kidding. I realize this is a unidirectional conversation. Just having some fun. But the bottom line is that this is the United Nations, and this is a translator booth where a few of the translators are sitting. If I let you stare at it long enough, the screens probably would have been the best clue as to what you may have been looking at. But where I'm going for here is I want to use an analogy to try to begin the description of what an XF is providing for us from an automation perspective. So in the analogy, all of these translators, real time, are translating the languages that the various countries are speaking into their home country's language. So to restate that in a different way, they're translating a foreign, unrecognizable language into a recognizable, simple one for the members of their country. This is basically what the XFs do. They translate complex into simple, or unrecognizable into recognizable. So think of the languages in this analogy as the applications within your landscape, and the XFs are serving as the translators. Then begin to imagine how difficult this translator's job would be if those languages were changing on a regular frequency. And that's what we talked about earlier, is the fact that our applications are being touched so regularly. But even in the face of change, and when that is the case, our XFs are much more sustainable than any other solution on the market, allowing you as an automation user, allowing you to be a master of automation against your web applications without having to spend a lot of time maintaining those web applications and the automation for it. So we'll drill into that slightly more as we proceed. What I'd like to do is basically give a little bit of a visual demonstration about what I'm talking about. So I tried to use an analogy to paint the picture a little bit. And now I'd like to kind of show you what an optimization can provide from an automation perspective within the Worksoft solution against a modern web application. So in this demonstration, what we're going to do is bring up some of the same pieces of our solution that we were using before. I'm going to bring up Capture. I'm going to use Fiori to, well, in fact, we're just going to pick on a Fiori tile, a very simple mechanism within the Fiori solution. It's really just serving as a push button for the user, yet it can contain some very valuable information about the realm that they're about to enter when they press that button. And the fact is that that is a complex, non-standard or non-intrinsic HTML structure that we have optimized for so that we can react and use that tile push button appropriately as the automation replays those operations on behalf of the user. So what we're doing here is I'm drilling into Capture to where I can override the optimizations that we can apply. Our optimizations now are basically automatic. You load them into our database, and then the user just does capture and performs their automation. But in this case, I've overridden that, and I've turned off the optimizations, and I'm acting like a user, and I'm clicking on various parts of the Fiori tile. Because once again, the automation can never mandate how the user uses the application. So there's no guarantee that we might click on the words of the tile or the center of the tile. But the fact is that without an optimization, based on where we've clicked, we render some various different results. On the first, clicking on Create Sales Order button, that's being highlighted there as the object that we learned, happens to be a div tag for our HTML people, and using the normalized inner text for recognizing that object. Not a bad definition, quite honestly. It's sitting within the list item, the LI item that I've just highlighted. And so it's a part of the overall structure, but it's not representing the structure itself. But not a bad definition. That's probably fairly sustainable. However, this next one is when I clicked on the center of the tile. And really, there's no content there. There's nothing even in the properties to re-identify that object to get back to it. So we defaulted to an XPath, which is what a lot of our competition will use to identify objects. But for those that may not be aware, XPath is the ability to traverse down through the page to find that same object. But if anything else has changed, then the XPath is broken. So they're very brittle. And similarly, the icon with a $sign on it is learned using an XPath because there's no text, there's nothing to latch onto. So I'm just representing the fact that without an optimization and no control over the user, which we don't want anyway, based on where they've clicked, we're going to build the automation accordingly. And some of that automation is going to be more sustainable than other parts. However, with a minor effort of one person going in and creating an optimization for that tile, and it's basically just telling our product what that structure is so that it can recognize that structure and continue to use it accordingly, taking unrecognizable and making it recognizable, like we talked about in the analogy. So by putting the optimizations back in place, and again, they're basically automatic, but because I overrode and turned them off, I now am turning them back on. And I'm using a feature to re-identify that tile. And notice, regardless of where I hover over it, it's highlighting the entire tile. And in fact, when I click on it, the step that is learned is to press the Create Sales Order push button. And if we drill into the details, what I was alluding to before is that we really wanted to learn that list item. That was the structure that's providing that tile. And we've done that now using a variety of properties for that object and properties that are going to be much more sustainable over time. So we've eliminated any mandate for the user to have to do the right thing. We allow the user to just do what they normally would against the application, yet we've learned that object in the most sustainable way. And with this simple visual demonstration, I wanted to try to convey the results of these optimizations and how valuable they really are, and get that across the table. The other thing that's not known, but I want to take just a second to mention, is the fact that these optimizations are also not a one-to-one relationship. So it's not that I had to optimize the create sales order tile. We basically, with an optimization, have the ability to define structures in such a way that if we recognize those structures in other parts of the website, they continue to provide value. So by optimizing a quote-unquote tile within Fiori, that will serve the purpose for all of the tiles. So it's not a one-to-one relationship, it's a one-to-many, and typically is a single individual that's going to provide that optimization for the betterment of the capture users and the automation users within my entire company. So the needs, or the efforts of one serve the needs of many. Now under the sheets, this is very simplified, but I wanted to convey the point, the fact that optimizations participate not only during the learn of the objects, but in the execution of the objects. And the reason that that is so relevant is, again, we're trying to minimize effort and minimize maintenance over time. But when things do in fact change, we need it to be extremely simple to maintain our automation. The optimization layer provides that ability for us to make a repair without actually having to touch the automation. And so, we talked about the fact that they are not one-to-one with those objects. So it's much more convenient to be able to manipulate them without having to touch the automation itself. And the fact that those optimizations transcend not only structures found throughout that website, but also this would transcend the versions of your application. So when I've optimized for Fiori, it was very quick in my demonstration, but I actually chose to use our 1809 optimizations, which serve the needs of Fiori for 1709 and 1610. So they're backward compatible and they transcend the versions. And I've had many clients come up and be excited and talk to me about that fact as well. So this optimization layer is really our ability to keep up with the demands of modern web that are progressive and responsive, and help us to build more sustainable automation that requires less maintenance over time. So one other example to round things out would be something like this. On the left-hand side, I've got an intrinsic HTML select. A select tag is what provides that intrinsic drop-down capability within web for anybody that's not familiar. And on the right-hand side, I've got a complex HTML dropdown. Now, first and foremost, I wouldn't have known that without the labels, because through styles and HTML5, basically modern web capabilities, you really can make your objects look like whatever you need them to look like. So a visual inspection alone would not have told me that I'm dealing with something standard versus something more complex and perhaps not recognizable. And just to elaborate, a complex HTML dropdown is one that is constructed using other objects. So web developers, creative web developers, again, we're not, we realize that the reason why these complexities exist to provide high value to the users, we just have to be able to keep up with them. So as an example, a web developer began to construct their combo box so that they can inject it with JavaScript, for example, as one example, and provide a type ahead feature. So as you begin to type the selection, you can have a multi-key type ahead feature, which was not originally provided by the standard HTML select tag. Now that differs in HTML5 and as things progress, but you kind of hopefully can get the point that the developers can take charge and build what they want to within their websites using the means that are provided through modern web applications. Well, when they do, there's some results of that from an automation perspective, and that's part of what I'd like to talk about. First and foremost, picking on the same application, but maybe a different object this time, what I'd like to do is clear my capture window and then drill into the sales order area. And let's get down to a combo box, because I keep referring to the fact that some of these complexities cannot be determined through visual inspection alone, but a quick inspection using the Worksoft solution can provide some insight as to what you might be dealing with from an automation perspective. And as you begin to capture and use that automation, it's going to be extremely obvious. But even in the beginning, I can use capture, like in this case, to turn on a validation step and then inspect the object, basically. So what I'm doing here again is turning off the optimizations. I wanted to show you that without the Fiori optimizations, there are complex dropdowns within Fiori, and I'm saying that really from experience. But the way that we began to learn that is by using the Worksoft solution. When I hover over that combo box, you can see that it comes to us in two parts. On the left would be an input box, and on the right would be an object designed to invoke the dropdown, which would bring a hidden table or a hidden list for the selection. So the developers have constructed a complex object for the purpose of providing the exact user interface and interaction that they wanted to. However, when we turn on the optimizations, they take effect immediately, and I'm hovering over the exact same combo box, and you can see that it's now highlighting the entire perimeter of not just the input box, but including the dropdown. We're now recognizing that as a dropdown, complex dropdown box within Fiori. And once again, probably the most important thing to say is that that is not an optimization just for that dropdown, but rather the ability to recognize that dropdown structure so that that single optimization throughout Fiori now assists me in learning and reusing automation against those dropdowns with that single optimization. So I talked about the results, and I'll just kind of round out with this. I'm going to break this down fairly granularly, but just 3 quick slides to wrap things up. And what I'm getting at is, in a non-optimized situation, I want to make sure that this was crystal clear, that if we turned on capture and dropped down the select and chose item 2, the end result, sort of stated at the top right of this slide, is that we're going to end up with 2 automated steps. We're going to click the select dropdown, and we're going to select item 2. So the considerations on each of these slides is what we're going to focus on then as a result. The fact is that it is positive that it supports capture. So that's because capture is something that I can distribute now to end users and ask them to turn that on around normal activity. And as a result, little do they realize sometimes even that they're building documentation, which we haven't even looked at, and automation, which we have looked at. So those automated steps that we collect from capture, we can throw that immediately into a document for the purpose of documenting that activity as well, and then use those automated steps to replay those actions. So when the users capture without optimizations where they might be needed, basically like in this example, we end up with 2 steps. The steps were described above. One would be to click and drop down the selection, and 2 would be to select item 2. The disadvantage, or the real, probably the important disadvantage here, is that that operation cannot necessarily be data driven. And that is important because rarely are we really reperforming the exact same actions with the same data. And we are all about the ability to pull the data out of the actions and drive them with alternate sets of data. Not exactly something we've gotten into in today's session, for example, but that's an integral part of maximizing your automation capabilities. So that's why we learn the objects as sustainably as we can so that we can really drive those objects with actions that consist of even varying sets of data. So to go to the next level, if I were to get dynamic with this, which we talked about our dynamic capabilities, they have their place in the world, but the fact is that using dynamic capabilities, I could make this work the way that I want it to, but it would require me to make those steps, and that's the disadvantage here. Again, we're trying to meet that expectation of capture great content directly from the user and minimize the effort needed to make that automation be exactly what we need it to be. So using the dynamic capabilities and without really describing them in full, I can say simply that we would end up with 3 steps involved. We would have that same first step to click the select and drop down the selection. Then we could insert a step to dynamically change item 2 to whatever we want it to be for that purpose at that moment. That could be driven from a spreadsheet of data. That could be driven from a query from a relational database. So we can drive this step with our test data, but it required us to inject an additional step to make that happen. So if we look at the considerations, after we have captured, we then have to apply the dynamic step, which renders, I'm showing this as a disadvantage, 3 steps overall, because that's more steps that I have to maintain if in fact I need to change this area. And it typically requires an automation expert to make that happen. And that may not be the right verbiage. It typically requires a trained Worksoft user to make that happen. Is probably the better way of saying that. But it can be data driven, and that is the advantage. So how do we get the best of both of these worlds? And that's where the optimizations come back into play. So if one person takes the moment to optimize that object and inject that right into the database so that others can take advantage, the end result will automatically be that through the use of capture, a normal user dropping down the list and making a selection, we will end up recognizing that in our AI engine and creating a single step that represents selecting item 2 from that object. It's supported by capture. As mentioned, we end up with 1 step overall. I'm now stepping through the considerations. And there is no automation expert or even trained user involved to make this happen at this point. And this can absolutely be data driven because the selection becomes a drop down, or can be from a variable or from a query or from a spreadsheet like we talked about before. So once again, just trying to paint the result of the value of these optimizations and what they're providing to our solution to allow us to keep up with modern web automation. All right. Well, I didn't realize my slide had gone off the end here, but I certainly appreciate everybody attending today. I believe that we have a few minutes for additional questions, so I'd like to field a few of those, and then we'll absolutely follow up with any questions after the fact that we're not able to get to. So Alicia, I'll throw back to you for the questions.
Thanks, Ty. Yes, we do have a few questions. First is, can you test Salesforce Lightning with Capture?
Absolutely. And it is exactly that. You begin with Capture, which builds automated steps, and Salesforce Lightning is absolutely a very responsive application. I've just begun to work with it more in the recent past, and it's been fun to recognize how menus disappear and screens change accordingly to respond to the user environment. But our automation has no problem with that.
Okay. Another question: do Capture and Certify handle table data for me?
Yes. And we didn't really get far enough into the weeds to see that. So I'm going to just quickly verbally describe the fact that Capture will collect the data that the user uses. That becomes a valuable asset, no doubt. We are not given data that is secure, like a password, for example. The applications will not hand us that data, but we'll still build the step for entering a password. We just won't have the password. But all of the data that we are given access to is collected, because that becomes data that's now available for driving automated testing. It becomes an additional source of content that you can drive your tests with. And so that data will naturally flow right into the Certify automation, or is easily replaced with alternate sets or variants of your data.
Great, thank you. We are pretty close to time here, so we will halt on taking more questions, but those that were submitted, we will follow up with an answer with you via email, and everyone who registered will receive a copy of the recording by early next week. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.